from Texas Christian University. And he will talk in this Asian migration seminar series, which is co-hosted by the Waseda Institute of Asia Pacific Studies Colloquium Series. And his talk is going to be on his book, Help Not Wanted, Immigration Politics in Japan. So if I could introduce Mike a little bit, Professor Michael Strausz is an associate professor of political science and director of Asian studies at Texas Christian University, which is in Fort Worth, I believe. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of Washington. And he's currently editing a book by an interdisciplinary group of scholars, tentatively titled The Past and Future of Immigration in Japan, which aims to put recent immigration reforms into context. So this book, which he's going to discuss with us today, Help Not Wanted, Immigration Politics in Japan, was published in 2019 with the State University of New York Press in the US. And without further ado, I would like to invite Mike to tell us the latest about the developments after this book, and also what the book itself discusses. So please, we are so happy to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Glenda. It's a real honor to be speaking to the Institute of Asian Migrations at Waseda. So many great scholars of immigration there. So I'm really happy to be able to share some of my research. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over the central argument of my book. And then I'm going to talk about some developments that have happened since my book came out, both the progress of this new visa category that was established in 2018, and then also the 2019 House of Councilors election, and look at the role that immigration played in that election. So that's sort of my overall plan. And then, of course, I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID and immigration. And that's a place where I'll be really interested to hear about your thoughts and experiences, people that are in Japan, about the sort of the role of COVID in immigration policy. But the overall question of my book that I'm trying to answer here is sort of visually clear when you look at this graph, right? So if we're looking at wealthier countries, OECD countries, you can see that Japan has relatively few foreign residents compared to most of these other countries. Now, this data is a little bit old, but it hasn't actually changed much since then. So the pattern remains roughly the same. Japan has very few foreign residents. I think they've climbed above 3%, although but anyway, so why? That's the central question of the book. And I think that this is an interesting and important question. I got particularly interested in this question for a few different reasons. The first has to do with labor shortages. So this has changed a little bit with COVID and some of the economic downturns that came out of that. But before COVID and likely after, Japan is faced with intense labor shortages. So you can see these are all help wanted signs that I was taking these pictures as I was doing research in Japan. This is just a few. I created an album of all the different help wanted signs that I saw when I was in Japan researching this book. It was many hundreds. My favorite here is I was working at the University of Tsukuba, and this was on the bus going to my university. There was a sign on the side of the bus that said bus drivers wanted. So there's really intense labor shortages spread throughout the economy, but particularly in the secondary labor market, or in what are sometimes called manual labor type jobs. And so given these intense labor shortages, of course, one way of filling these jobs is through foreign labor. And yet Japan has very few foreign laborers, right? So not surprisingly, there's a relationship here. Countries that have more foreign residents tend to have less labor shortages. And the way that I measure labor shortages here is there was this consulting firm called the Manpower Group that polls hiring managers in something like 50 different countries. And they asked them, one of the questions that they were asking at this time, this is from a few years ago, again, before COVID, they were asking the question, are you having trouble filling jobs? jobs. And of the 50 countries in which they polled hiring managers, Japan was the hiring managers in Japan reported the most difficulty filling jobs. And then of course, Japan had a small number of foreign residents too. So I think those things are pretty clearly related. But this wasn't just a problem. What was going on in Japan wasn't just a problem of a relatively short-term labor market shortages. There was also a longer-term problem, right? Of what's called in Japanese shoshi koreika, or the problem of fewer young people, more old people, right? So another way to visualize this is that the population pyramid in Japan is turning upside down, right? So you have increasing numbers of old people that are moving towards retirement, fewer middle-aged people, and then fewer children. And so this presents a problem because there's the question of who will physically care for the older people as they get older, but also who will keep the economy running so that it can continue to fund social services and things like that. And of course, one possible answer to these questions is foreign labor, right? So it's possible that foreign labor, or more broadly, immigration, could help address this problem. And yet Japan has been reluctant to do that. And then finally, this is actually something that Glenda and I were just talking about, relates to oh yeah, I'm sorry. We'll look at this graph one more time, and then I'll tell you the third reason this is puzzling. So returning to this graph, one thing that separates Japan from really all the other countries on this graph is this number. Again, this is from a few years ago. This number's actually gone up, right? But Japan had the highest percentage of its population over the age of 60. It's the aging society problem in Japan is the most extreme anywhere in the world. And so of course, if you compare Japan with these other countries, Hungary, Poland, Mexico, that have similarly low percentages of foreign residents, they have more young people that can fill these jobs, right? Where Japan doesn't have access to that. And I'll briefly throw up the rest of the numbers just in case you want to take a look at the rest of the numbers. Okay. And the final reason I think that it's puzzling that Japan has so few foreign residents has to do with the question of international image. And this is specifically true relating to refugee policy or asylum policy, right? So Japan's asylum policy, we can talk about the reasons for this, but it's very restrictive. Japan is very reluctant to grant asylum to foreign residents compared with other advanced industrialized countries. So I'm gonna just show you a little bit of comparative data. I actually just generated these graphs today, but you can see overall, Japan is getting a pretty decent number of applications for asylum. These are just the numbers of people that are applying. 2017 was the peak. 2020 was pretty low, pretty related to COVID. But compared with sort of similarly sized European countries, these numbers are actually reasonably low. So here, this is comparing Japan with France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK. It's a little bit hard to see Japan here because Germany is really standing out. So I generated this graph again without Germany. And here you can see that Japan is, compared with these four countries, Japan is relatively low. And certainly if you throw in, if you throw in Germany, it gets even lower. However, this in and of itself isn't a problem. The fact that people aren't applying for asylum in Japan doesn't particularly make Japan look bad. What makes Japan look bad is that so few people get asylum. So looking at, in terms of successful asylum claims, so the people that get asylum, you can see that Japan is pretty low. Now, it's not the lowest every year compared with these countries, but when when people apply for asylum, states have a number of ways to reply. And they can grant asylum, they can reject asylum, but they can also say, well, we're not going to give you the status of, a UNHCR, like an official refugee, but we'll still let you stay for humanitarian reasons. Japan does that, and all of these countries do that too. So some of the countries that are like, for example, Italy, that doesn't give a lot of people asylum, they really like to grant to give humanitarian consideration, right? But Japan doesn't really do that very much either. So they don't give a large percentage of people asylum, or they don't give a lot of people humanitarian status. And again, because these Italian bars are so big, it sort of makes it hard to see the differences. So I generated it again without Italy. And here you can see still Japan, although in 2011, they gave a relatively high percent of their relatively low number of applicants humanitarian status. Since then, it's been really, really tiny. And of course, the year that's most famous is 2017, when I think I showed you earlier that something like almost 20,000 people applied and something like 20 people got asylum that year. So it was very, overall, this is a place where Japan comes off looking pretty bad internationally. And this is the question of looking bad internationally is something that Japanese elites are often pretty sensitive to. Japanese elites frequently don't like Japan to look bad internationally, and yet with regard to refugee, the refugee issue, they seem willing to continue this system in which Japan grants really, really small percentage of people asylum or sort of any kind of humanitarian status permitting them to stay in Japan. Okay, so that's the overall question. Why does Japan have so few foreign residents? I think it's an important question, right? Because of the labor shortages, the declining population, as well as the fact that on the refugee policy side, it makes Japan look really bad, which is something that Japanese elites are often sensitive to. So why then does Japan have so few foreign residents? So in my book, I walk through a number of different explanations before I get to my explanation. Today, I'm gonna just briefly highlight them and go through some of the problems with the existing explanations that I drew from the literature. So one of the things that I heard a lot from Japanese elites when I was researching this book, from governing elites, but also from some people in business, was the reason that Japan has so few foreign residents, the argument was not because of restrictions, policy restrictions by the Japanese government, but it's rather just because people don't want to come to Japan. Japanese is a hard language to learn. The Japanese working hours are really long, so Japan is an unappealing destination. And I think that there is something to this argument, especially with regard to, highly educated, knowledge economy workers, computer engineers, things like that. I think that for people that have a lot of options, people with advanced degrees, Japan does sometimes have trouble attracting those people, although there are plenty of those people that choose Japan, but those people have a lot of options, and sometimes many of those people won't choose Japan. But if we think about manual laborers, the people that don't have advanced degrees, or refugees, right? For those people, I don't think it doesn't make sense to say, oh, they wouldn't choose Japan, because in many cases, if you're talking about manual laborers from the developing world, a move to Japan, temporary or more permanent, would mean a huge increase in salary, right, which they could share with their families. And in the case of refugees, if the choice that they're presented with is remaining in a refugee camp or going to Japan, especially if the trip to Japan includes language training and as well as job training, it's hard to imagine refugees turning that down, right? So I think that the supply side explanation, I think, is really geared, but it makes sense when talking about highly educated potential migrants, but I think it falls apart when looking at other groups. So the second argument that a lot of scholars make when they try to explain why Japan has so few foreign residents has to do with institutions. And people talk both about domestic and international institutions, right? So I'm just going to focus on international institutions, because the way that this argument is sometimes made is the reason that some of those countries that we looked at earlier, like Germany and Italy, especially Germany and France, have so many foreign residents is because they're members of the European Union, and the European Union courts have essentially made those countries admit more foreign residents than they wanted to, by doing things like family reunification, and by letting people who Germany might have wanted to be temporary guest laborers, by letting them stay in Germany longer than the German state might have wanted to. And so in other words, it's because Japan is not a member of an organization like the European Union that Japan is able to restrict migration. And I think that the problem with this argument is, well, first, there's two problems, the way that I see it. The first is that I think it exaggerates the role of the European Union courts in forcing Germany and France and other European states to liberalize their immigration policy. That's the first problem. And the second problem is that it can't account for other countries that aren't members of the European Union, but that have greatly expanded immigration since the end of World War II, such as New Zealand, Australia, Canada. Okay. And then the final argument that I've seen in a couple different places has to do with the developmental state. And this is a theory that goes back to Chalmers Johnson, a scholar of Japanese political economy. His book from 1982. Basically, he argued that, his book was called Media and the Japanese Economic Miracle. And he explained the Japanese economic miracle, what he called economic miracle, with reference to intelligent sort of long-term thinking, long-term planning by Japanese bureaucrats, and especially economic planning bureaucrats. And some people have tried to make this same argument about bureaucrats with regard to their, using the same sort of long-term thinking with regards to Japanese immigration policy. And the problem is the people that have made this argument haven't actually spent a lot of time listening to Japanese bureaucrats or looking at their work. So I feel like this argument has sort of been made in a way that it's just sort of like, oh, well, if it applied to economic planning, it must also apply to immigration planning. And so I think that we need to look beyond these three explanations, and I think we can draw something from each of them, but instead I found it helpful to think about immigration control policy. So which countries restrict immigration in this way? So I use this sort of 2x2 table. Political scientists are sort of famous for our love of 2x2 tables. So this is my 2x2 table, and I'll talk about each of the axes separately. I'm going to start on this one. Right, so the first axis, the first way that we can sort of separate countries in terms of their immigration policy has to do with thinking about immigration as a struggle between the state and labor-intensive businesses. So if we think there are businesses that want to admit foreign laborers and the state wants to block them for a variety of reasons, do the businesses win or does the state win? And the answer to that question helps determine a part of immigration policy. In Japan and in these other countries as well, I argue basically the state won. The state did not give the labor-intensive businesses what they wanted. And why was that? So why did the state defeat big business in Japan? Why was big business not able to convince the state that it actually needs foreign labor? And to answer this question, it's helpful to go back in time a little bit to start to think about when Japan first developed labor shortages. And to answer that question, it's helpful to think about the history of agriculture in Japan, very briefly, right? So, I mean, just compared with some of those other countries we were looking at earlier, Japan had a pretty large percentage of its population working in agriculture for a much longer time than some of those other countries we were looking at earlier, right? Compared with Japan, compared with France, Germany, the UK, Japan is the line on top here. So why does that matter? Well, that matters because the labor shortages that were developing in this period were often in factories. And factory employers, your Toyotas and Hondas and semiconductor builders and all those different kinds of companies, to recruit laborers, to recruit manual laborers, they could go to farms, essentially, go to agricultural areas and offer more money, more reasonable hours, the amenities of a big city. Right, so they were, instead of having to go to foreign laborers, they could actually recruit domestically, recruit from agricultural areas. Now, if you look at the German line right here, 1961, West Germany first started to sign guest worker agreements with a few different countries, including Turkey, right? What that meant was essentially West German firms were struggling enough to convince those remaining farmers to come off the farms. They started to go to the state and say, hey, we need a way to bring in some foreign laborers to work in some of these manual labor type jobs. Now, Japan didn't reach the level of the percentage of its population working in farms that Germany was at when it started to make those guest worker agreements until 1973, right? So Japanese firms had a much longer period in which they could recruit from Japanese farms. What happened? So in the years leading up to 1973, Japanese firms actually had some limited success in getting the state to try out early versions of the trainee program, and as well as early versions I think it was basically trainees. And right around 1973, they were looking at some sort of program to let in, a few thousand laborers. So they were starting to work something out with the Japanese state. But then in 1973, you had the oil shocks right after the Yom Kippur War, led to a huge global economic downturn. And Japanese firms were no longer facing labor shortages because there was a global recession. And so they took the pressure off the Japanese state. They no longer needed foreign laborers. And really, labor shortages didn't get severe again until the 1980s. And by the 1980s, Japanese elites, Japanese governing elites, particularly in the Ministry of Justice, had a number, 30 years of experience viewing, observing the experience of West Germany and France and the UK, what it viewed as its peer countries with foreign labor. And those elites, especially in the Ministry of Justice, came to view the experience of European countries with foreign labor as a failure. Now, that's not the only interpretation they could have made, but reading over like diet debates at that time, it's pretty clear that when experts are brought in from the Ministry of Justice, their agenda is, this has been a disaster in Europe and we need to avoid that kind of disaster in Japan, right? So ultimately, 1989, you get this debate between some people like in the Ministry of Labor and elsewhere that want to set up some sort of basically manual labor visa or some sort of guest worker type program. And then the Ministry of Justice that says, no, because labor shortages are again bad at this time. The Ministry of Justice that says, no, we can't do that. The best we can do is have some sort of trainee visa, which will permit, a smaller number of people to come. It will be a development program, at least officially a development program. They'll come, they'll train for a few years and they'll leave, right? But we'll be able to control that a lot more, keep the numbers lower and avoid the problems that they had in Europe. And that side, the side advocating a trainee visa as a way to partially alleviate labor shortages without what they view as the out of control experience with immigration of some European states is that side won, right? The Ministry of Justice won this debate. And so what ends up happening after 1989, the labor shortages don't go away. So firms get creative, right? And so they have basically three main sources of manual labor. The first is, and I guess this data here starts in 96. So it was a few years after that law. So the first source, sort of the clearest line, it increasingly used as a source of foreign labor are foreign students, right? So foreign students are an important source of foreign labor, especially in the restaurant industry in Japan. And then here's that trainee visa that I told you about. So there was a dip following the global recession in 2008, but it's taken off since then. And then you have this long-term residency visa. This is where the so-called Nikkei, people with Japanese ancestry, also people that are the who have Japanese dependents, right? So if you are like non-Japanese, but you're a child, is Japanese because your spouse is Japanese, or your spouse was Japanese, you got divorced. This is a potential visa for you. But the largest group that uses this are Brazilians. So the Nikkei Brazilians. So these three groups, and that visa status, by the way, was established in that 1989 revision to the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act. But the people that framed that pushed that law didn't anticipate how much it would be used or how much firms would come to rely on that as a side door for foreign labor. Okay, so because there was no direct sort of manual labor visa, instead, Japanese firms come to rely on these three sources of foreign labor. Okay, so I sort of covered the X, or I guess the Y axis here. So labor-intensive businesses were not able to convince the government to admit foreign laborers because the government, and especially the Ministry of Justice, were able to carefully observe the European experience with immigration, and they came to think, like, we don't want to have that in Japan. How about this? Now, this, I can talk more about this axis in question and answer in terms of how I define my terms here. I think I'm reasonably careful with it in the book, but I'm just going to say now that compared with both, compared with the countries where there is a influential group of elites which thinks that foreigners, at least some significant number of foreigners, belong, countries like Japan, South Korea, Hungary, etc., even if there are elites that think that some significant number of foreigners belong, those people don't really hold power for a sustained amount of time, right? So the people that are in power, in political power, in government, don't really think that foreigners belong. And thus they don't push for admitting other groups of foreigners for non-economic reasons, right? So here, when we're talking about the Y-axis, it's pretty much economic reasons. Those people are coming as laborers. For the X-axis, these are people that might not come as laborers. They might come for reasons of ethnic solidarity, for other reasons, which I'm happy to go into. But in Japan, there hasn't really been an influential strain of elite thought which says that large numbers of foreigners belong in Japan. And again, I'll be happy to talk more about that in question and answer. Okay. So as I was finishing my book, the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act was revised. There was another major revision. It had been revised a number of times since 1989, but there was another major revision. So I'm going to briefly talk about that. I'm able to mention it in my book, but we didn't really get to see how the revision actually would matter when my book came out, or what would actually come out of it. So now we've had a little bit of time to observe. So we'll talk a little bit about what it's looked like. So what did the revision do? Well, it did a number of things. The first was it established these specified skills visas. So these 14 new visa categories, which include a variety of categories which we would call manual laborers, right? So these would include things like construction, agriculture, etc. So these are new visa categories. This is the first time that people without college degrees or computer skills are admitted to Japan as laborers rather than as trainees or as co-ethnics or with another reason, or as students. They're admitted as laborers for the first time in post-war Japanese history with these 14 new visa categories. So shortly after the law was passed, in a cabinet understanding, the Abe cabinet announced this goal. So it was going to be 350,000 people, almost 350,000 people. That was the goal over the next 5 years. So it wasn't going to be immediately. It was going to be that many people. And also the revision created a new office to help foreigners adjust to Japan. So these were three of the major components of that law. Okay. So what did that law do? So first of all, I keep waiting for the government to release new data. The most recent data they released is from December of 2020. So I keep waiting for the March of 2021 data, which hasn't come out yet. But you can see these are where the people who are using the new visa status are coming so you can see the largest group comes from Vietnam, then China, Indonesia, Philippines, Myanmar, and then other countries. And you can see Japan has gotten up to about 16,000 people. So again, remember, the eventual goal is to get up to 350,000. So they're not really there yet. They got a ways to go before they get to that 350,000. And just so you get a sense of what, remember, this is actually 14 new visa categories. So you get a sense of what these new visa categories are looking like, or what people are getting visas to do. You can see here, the most used status is food and beverage. This is food and beverage manufacturing, like working in plants to packaged food and beverage, and then followed by agriculture, construction, industrial machinery, and metals. So those are the top 5 visa types with this new visa. Now, where are these people going? Well, they're going to the prefectures that have more labor shortages. So job seekers ratio is a measure of labor shortages. Higher numbers means more scarcity, right? It's the ratio of the number of jobs to job seekers. So like when it's 2, that means for every 2 jobs, there's 1 job seeker. So it's good for the job seekers, but bad, but it's a labor shortage, right? So this is not a super strong relationship, but there is a relationship, so that in prefectures that have more labor scarcity, it looks like there is a larger percentage of the people are using this status. Although you can see it's a very, very small percent in terms of total residents, right? And that's not surprising. It was only 16,000 people. But interestingly, if you look at how much stronger this relationship is, they're going to where the trainees were, right? So this is actually very strong, right? So I think that in a lot of ways, these new visa categories are to supplement and perhaps eventually replace the trainee program, right? This is a very strong relationship here. So in prefectures that had a higher percentage of its population made up of trainees, they also have a higher percentage of their population made up of these new visa categories. Okay. So why did this happen? Why did this reform of the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act happen in late 2018? Well, I think a part of this has to do with those labor shortages we were talking about earlier, right? So if you look at this graph here, remember, job seekers ratio is a measure of labor scarcity. Higher numbers mean more labor scarcity. It means employers are having a harder time finding jobs. You can see that up until the early 2010s, the peak here, the blue line is new job seekers and the red line is all job seekers. The peak here was in that period we were just talking about, right? Right around when the number of agricultural workers in Japan was shrinking and Japanese firms started to try to encourage the Japanese state to look abroad. But then the next peak was this time, 1989. And remember, we talked about 1989. That was when Japan made that huge revision to the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act, which ended up leading to the trainee visa, the technical internship visa, as well as the long-term residency visa that Nikkei used. Right, and you can see that Japan reached that 1989 level again in right around 2015, right? And then it kept climbing, right? So this was a time pre-COVID, so you can see that these numbers both dipped, although still like pretty high according to the last data that I had. But Japan was facing the worst labor shortages that it ever faced. And so Japanese firms were able to go to the Japanese state and say, we need laborers, right? We're not able to cut it with students, with trainees, with long-term residency. We need more foreign laborers. And so the Japanese state, in this case, obliged because the labor shortages were so extreme. But the discourse didn't change that much, at least on the elite level. So what Abe was saying, as he pushed through this change, he continued to insist that this was not an immigration policy, that this new visa category was not, it was essentially more of the same. And he was saying this for two reasons that, again, kept coming up over and over. The first was foreign workers couldn't bring their families, right? They would essentially come by themselves. This isn't totally true. I mean, there's some of the visa categories you would be able to bring your families, but he didn't emphasize that. And the second thing is that there would be time limits on how long foreign workers under these new visa categories would be permitted to remain in Japan. So in other words, these people would come alone, they would work temporarily, and then they would leave. So this was how Abe was framing it, to try to, and again, making it clear, this is not an immigration policy. That's how he was advocating it. And instead, this was sort of a temporary foreign labor policy, not that different from what we've done in the past. And interestingly, this seems to have caused a change in the way that LDP Diet members and candidates talked about immigration, or at least, so this is the Taniguchi Asahi poll before every election. They ask all candidates a wide variety of questions. One of the questions they've been asking since 2009 has to do with foreign labor. Do you support the promotion of foreign labor? And up until the 2019 election, now here I'm just looking at LDP candidates and Diet members. Up until 2019, a majority had never said they support the admission of foreign laborers. But in 2019, after that revision to the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act was passed, for the first time, you get a very substantial majority, 72.5% of LDP candidates and Diet members saying that they support foreign labor, right? So this is, I think, a reflection of the fact that this sort of became a policy of the LDP because Abe pushed it through, even though he was denying that it was an immigration policy. Okay, I want to conclude. I feel like I said I would talk for 40 minutes. So I think this will get me right up till there, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answer. But I want to conclude a little bit by talking about COVID. And this is something, again, where I will be very interested in hearing your experience, especially those of you that are in Japan right now. I haven't been to Japan since COVID started. I haven't been out of the United States since COVID started. But one of the things, just from my reading and what I've observed around here is that I think that there's something going on here with the nature of COVID-19, that it spread so much by asymptomatic, no, I was thinking mathematically, but by asymptomatic infections, right? So you get all these people are spreading, most people that are spreading the disease don't themselves know that they have it. Right. And I think, unfortunately, what ends up happening, and this is not unique to Japan, I think this, I've definitely observed this in the United States too, is that because it's sort of like an invisible killer, people often look for cognitive shortcuts. And if they're sort of already prone to xenophobia, or if they're sort of flirting with xenophobia, or if they're susceptible to xenophobia, xenophobia seems like a shortcut that makes sense. Like, oh, well, I don't know who has COVID, so I'm just going to assume that it looks like the people who appear to be visually foreign, right? So in the United States, unfortunately, I think this has led to this horrible wave of attacks against Asians and Asian Americans that we see. I think it's because people are assuming or they're sort of associating those people with the spread of COVID. Again, without evidence. I mean, this is not, they don't have a reason to think that, but I think that's what's going on. And I think that some of that is going on in Japan as well. I think that some people, especially on the far right in Japan, seem to blame foreigners and downplay the role of the Japanese in spreading COVID. And this is something that I find concerning, right? As someone who studies immigration policy, and it does make me wonder about future pandemics in COVID. But also, I think Japan's policy response to COVID it's been surprising in a number of ways. So in some ways, it was generous in ways that surprised me. So for example, the trainees that I talked about, and members of the technical interns, right? So those people are sort of, in terms of foreign laborers in Japan, those people are relatively unprivileged in terms of their employment status, right? So they're basically tied to one firm, right? If they're unhappy with the way they're being treated, they don't really have any choices. They don't have geographic mobility or even mobility, like they can't go seek out a job with a different firm. They're stuck at the firm that brought them to Japan. And I think partially because of some of the economic difficulties that came with COVID, Japan relaxed those rules. So they let trainees, a group that's usually not treated particularly well by the law, move between jobs. And then also when there were stimulus payments that happened, those stimulus payments went to all foreigners that were legally in Japan, including, again, those trainees and technical interns, which again, I found that surprising a little bit because those groups usually aren't treated very well. But then on the other side of the ledger, Japan went through periods of being extremely strict about who could enter Japan, even permanent residents. There were times when permanent residents would not have been able to enter Japan, or well, definitely would have. And so, you know, I knew many foreign permanent residents that ended up deciding not to leave Japan to visit family or whatever, because they weren't sure they would be able to get back into the country despite having permanent residency. And so that was unusual because, again, usually a lot of the people that have permanent residency are you know, highly educated, usually treated pretty well by Japan's immigration policy. And this was a place where Japan got pretty strict, and I think unusually strict when compared with other advanced industrialized countries. Like, I think for the most part, other countries were treating permanent residents, letting those people re-enter their countries if they left. Okay, so those are just some of my observations about COVID and immigration, but I would be happy to hear your thoughts. But so that's it for now. And I think, yeah, that was, I think I hit the 40-minute time limit. So I will be happy to hear your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike, for a very stimulating talk. And okay, looks like we have some questions already. If you can put your questions in the chat, that would be good. So let's see, we have one. Really enjoyed the talk. Could you please comment on why your research differs from Gracia Leo Ferrer's, who claims that Japan is an immigrant nation? Okay.
Yeah, I feel like I have Gracia's book, Professor Lou Ferrier's book, right around here. I should hold it up, but I don't see it. But I'm not sure that Professor Lou Ferrier and I differ that much, because I think that we would both agree that there are actually these immigrants that live in Japan, right? And I think her book is terrific, highly recommended. And she does a really great job of painting a picture of the complexities of that immigrant population that lives in Japan. However, I think we would also agree that the number of immigrants in Japan is small when compared with other advanced industrialized countries. And I think a part of that is related to, I mean, even in her title, I don't remember the exact name of the subtitle, but it's something about immigrant belonging in an ethno-nationalist state. So I think that the fact that Japanese elites still treat Japan as an ethno-nationalist state, I think that really limits the ability of Japan to admit immigrants or to increase immigration in a way that looks like other advanced industrialized states. So I mean, Professor Leo Ferrier and I, Gracia and I, presented together at UCSD. And so, yeah, I'm not sure that we disagree that much, although I think she's here. So maybe she can jump in if she wants to, well, to highlight areas of disagreement.
Thank you. Gracia, are you here?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I actually came in late, but I remember a time wrong. So yeah, so I missed the first part of your talk, Mike, but I read your book twice, which I loved it and cited many times. What I want to say is that I think our kind of focus is different. You're focusing on this top-down approach, you know, why government does not want immigrants, while my focus is on immigrants themselves. why immigration is taking place in Japan. What do immigrants want? So I think my point is that if we do not recognize that Japan is an immigrant country, then what are we? The immigrants who live in Japan and make Japan our home. So we need to give immigrants a voice and highlight that this process is going on, and also highlight the constraints and immigrants' agency in the whole process. So I think we agree on the point that Japan is not that open to immigration, and but I think we just have different focuses. So Jill, thanks for the question.
Thank you. It looks like we have another question here. Does Japan have the infrastructure to support a big wave of immigration? If Japan created a policy to change Japan's population to 10 to 20% of foreign laborers, what aspects of the Japan's services, systems, government might make that possible?
Yeah, I think that if the Japanese state really sat down and said, we want to become an immigration nation, I think it would not just be a question of opening up the borders or even just saying we're going to be much more free with who gets different visa statuses. I think there would be a lot that would be necessary in terms of language education, and just like, I feel like the thing that always comes up is garbage, right? So that's something the Japanese always worry about, is making sure people know how to put, which trash goes out on which days. But of course, that's sort of a stand-in for a lot of different things. I think there would need to be a large-scale efforts to incorporate foreigners into Japan, and then also to perhaps teach Japanese how to deal with foreigners too. So I think that this would have to be a project that the state would have to take really seriously and put a lot of thought into. And I think that if they just admit a bunch of, oh, we need this many laborers, so let's just admit laborers without giving much thought to where they're going to live and how they're going to get along, I think that could be really that could end up being a really bad policy and making a lot of people very unhappy, including the laborers.
Thank you. Does that satisfy the person who asked the question?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was David, right? The next question is, thank you. Do we know the percentage of people coming back to their country after coming to Japan? It would seem foreign workers do not stay in Japan, so the Japan is welcoming migrants is very small and will stay small. It seems to have a migrant policy like Qatar and not like France. That person observes.
Yeah, I mean, so so what part of that I'm trying to, I mean, I think that this is something Erin Chung has argued. Basically, she's essentially argued that Japan is already becoming like a Gulf state, like a Qatar more than like a European state. More, and I sort of feel like, pardon?
Erin Chung is arguing that?
Yeah, she's argued that. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's on a much smaller scale, because in some of those Gulf states, like they're like 85% or 80% foreign residents, but all of those foreign residents have no path to citizenship. I mean, they're really just temporary workers. They have no ability to unionize. So I think, I mean, from what I know, again, my specialty is in Japanese immigration policy rather than Gulf state, although I've read some stuff about Gulf state. My sense is that despite the very substantial problems with the way that Japan treats foreign residents, it's not nearly as bad as the Gulf states. I think that there are paths to citizenships, there are more workers' rights, I mean, there are democracies. So I don't know if I think that Japan, that's one possible future for Japan, but I don't go as far as Erin. I don't think Japan is there yet.
Thank you. Okay, where are we? I mean, the Japan is changing because of migrants line. seems overblown, and Abe seems right in saying Japan does not have a migration policy. And I think maybe the same person said also, do you have a comment on the immigration reform that was just shelved? What was your reaction to it?
Yeah, and again, that's something I would be interested to hear other people's thoughts on. I mean, I was just sort of trying to follow along in the paper and more seeing if it was going to pass. I didn't. So I don't have a great reaction to it. I was surprised that it was shelved because it seemed like, as of my reading of the paper yesterday, it seemed like it was definitely going to pass. I was surprised that it was shelved. I felt like maybe that suggested a little bit more concern with the welfare of foreigners than I thought, and also a little bit more concern with the minority parties, because it did seem like that it was really the minority parties that were pushing against that reform. But in terms of the content of the reform, I haven't yet studied up on it as much as I should have.
Well, it just happened.
Right, it just happened, yeah.
Okay, next person says, I look forward to reading this book. Thank you. 2 quick questions. Number 1, did you look at the real lack of focus on multiculturalism? 15 years, a regular topic of discussion. So that's number 1. Number 2, any research on the challenges we have in getting the people we need as defined by the government? Is that
So
right?
I'm not sure about the first question. I mean, because it seems like the whole tabunka kyosei, like there has been a lot of like, the government is happy to talk about promoting a certain kind of multiculturalism, you know, that you definitely hear about tabunka kyosei and like multicultural coexistence, like but yeah, there's research. Yeah, I don't know. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I'll focus on the second question. The 14 new visa categories are really new, right? There's only been, I mean, the government's been producing these reports every few months about how many people are using them. I was surprised that the numbers seem to have kept going up under COVID. I know that actually Glenda and Noriko have a chapter that they've written that specifically looks at the role of these. Well, one of the things that it looks at is the role of these brokers in helping to bring in these people. So, and it seems like it's essentially a whole another industry of that's being formed right now, of these brokers that are supposed to set up laborers with jobs. And so I imagine that, but I feel like but I don't know about research that's been done on specifically the challenges that firms are having of using those 14 new visa categories. I think it'd be an interesting avenue of research for the future.
Thank you. I think it's still new, right?
Right.
It's still pretty new, folks.
Yeah.
Last year, Professor David Slater at Sophia University organized research and workshops, including, wait a minute, that include how people in different industries, restaurants, mizu, shobai, trainees, have been impacted by COVID, and there are links to his video now available, and you can download the PDF from here.
Okay.
Oh, great. Thank you very
David
much.
Slater's work is great. So.
Yeah, thank you very much for the engaging talk. I've learned so much from your discussion. One argument for Japan to loosen, oh gosh, this is really hard to read, sorry, to loosen its immigration policy to accommodate more refugee intake is so that refugees can contribute to the Japanese economy as laborers against the backdrop of Shoshikoreka. Do you think this argument is viable? What needs to be done to gain the agreement or win the agreement of the decision makers such as MOJ and the Diet and the general public?
It definitely makes sense to me. Like, it seems like admitting more refugees is one way to help address labor shortages. But it seems like as of now, the Japanese state has really focused on labor admission policies that are really, this particular job is going to be filled by this particular person. And refugee admission doesn't really work like that. You have to just say, we're going to be a little bit more generous in who we admit in terms of refugees, and then give those people language training and job training, and then trust that they're going to be able to find jobs or maybe help them. So I think it would take the Japanese state being willing to give up a little bit of control in terms of moving from a model of setting up this person with this job to bringing in more people, giving them language training, and then helping them find jobs without knowing what job they'll take when we bring them in.
Right. Also, Mike, isn't it that when you bring refugees, if you did this for refugees, you are acknowledging that they're going to be long-term members of the society, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing, isn't it? I mean, you have to convince people that that's going to be a positive benefit.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, that's very right. And it's funny, I mean, Japan has, by the way, its own example, because it seems like, I mean, it's a small scale, but like the Vietnamese boat people that came into Japan, that seems to me like a success. Like those people seem to have like melded very nicely into Japanese society. So this idea that refugees are really scary, or, you know, it seems like Japan can look at its own history of admitting, you know, tens of thousands of Vietnamese boat people, and it seems to have gone okay. So, yeah.
Okay. Okay, let me see. A quick question. Considering Japanese elites and politicians, I can't see this. Sorry, does anybody, oh, considering that Japanese elites and politicians understand that the shortage of laborers that hinder the development of the economy, what's the rationale behind their reluctance of accepting more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially, so from the right, the people that are, you know, the LDP, overall, the LDP has moved in the direction of supporting foreign labor. But I think that the holdouts worry about, I mean, they'll express worries about crime, about social harmony. I mean, just like a fear of the unknown, fear of foreigners, fear of challenges to the ethno-nationalist identity. I think those are the things. On the left, when there is skepticism, I think it's often fear about bringing down wages or like fighting against undermining Japanese labor unions. So when there is skepticism from the left, that's where it comes from. But the skepticism on the right is much more politically important these days.
And are they very extremely vocal? Do you find?
On the left, you mean, or
no, on the right?
Well, yeah, I mean, so this is, you know, I'm the chapter that I'm working on for our book, the book that I'm editing, and that Glenda, Noriko, and Gracia, I'll have chapters in. I was just working on my chapter today, and I was looking at, you know, in the 2019 election, I was looking at that LDP, you know, all the candidates, only one candidate of the, you know, like 150 LDP candidates said that he was completely opposed to foreign labor. There was a few more that said somewhat disagreed, but everyone else was, and I think following that law, so I do think that marks a little bit of a sea change within the LDP. There was literally only one guy. He was from Kyoto. I'm going to talk about him in my chapter. Yeah. I'm forgetting his name right now. I was just reading about him today. But I think a part of what's going on is that this is a different project that I'm working on with one of my former undergraduates, who's now a graduate student at the University of Michigan. We did a survey experiment where we presented Japanese voters with a political candidate and randomly varied the candidate's stance on immigration. And one of the things that we found was that the people that are skeptical, that think that foreigners undermine Japan, or that are worried about foreigners undermining Japan, if they hear that a candidate supports immigration, they will vote against that candidate. But the people that think, oh no, multiculturalism is great, or foreigners enrich Japan, those people, if they hear that a candidate supports immigration, it won't affect the way that they vote. So in other words, even if there's a relatively small number, a small percentage of the Japanese population that's sort of vocally xenophobic, for those people, they're like one issue voters, right? And they're well organized, right? If you think about groups like Zaidoku-kai and other sort of Nate Smith has called the action conservative movement, sort of this new right-wing groups in Japan. They're relatively small as a percentage of population, but they're very vocal and very well organized, and they're one-issue voters. So I think that this is one of the things that Japanese politicians worry about. Like if they're too vocally in favor of immigration, they have to worry about a backlash from this well-organized right that's going to come after them.
So Mike, about this well-organized right, if I may ask a question, do you know anything about what their solution is to these labor issues, labor shortages, and do they have any policy recommendations that are actually?
So the people that I'm thinking about, I haven't read enough about Nippon Kaigi. I mean, I think they might have other kinds of recommendations, but here I'm thinking about more of groups like Zaitokukai. And I feel like from my knowledge of them is they're not really solution oriented. They're more about, we just hate foreigners, and Japan is not for Koreans, and Japan is not for Chinese, and we're just going to go intimidate those people. That's my reading of those kinds of groups.
I see.
And I really recommend Nate Smith's article from the SSJJ from a few years ago. Really nicely lays out because it's sort of a new turn among right-wing activists in Japan. Like this, specifically focusing on nativism is relatively, it goes back to only about 2005. And by the way, one thing that I've noticed that I feel like these two things must be related, is that before about 2005, LDP politicians, a pretty good number of them would support things like granting foreign permanent residents the right to vote in local elections in Japan. So looking at that, the Taniguchi data, in like 2003, it was something like a quarter of LDP politicians supported that. But then in 2005, right around then, you start to get the rise of Zaitokukai in these groups, and the LDP is afraid of them, I think. So they no longer support. There's very few LDP politicians now that support granting foreign permanent residents the right to vote in local elections. And I think that's directly related to the rise of those groups.
Interesting. Okay, let's see, the next question has to do with the myth of homogeneity, about the, Yamato Minzoku and so forth. Is that connected with this reluctance to admit foreign workers?
I do think so. I think that when there are the holdouts, like the people that don't want to, like, related to the question earlier about why, what the rationale is for people that continue to oppose for migration, I think that it does. There's this idea of Tanitsu Minzoku, that Japan is a country for the Japanese. So I do feel like, and especially for the activists, I think that is a really important rationale, that they really believe in this.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is about, have the two peaks of the labor shortages not happened when the global economic recession occurred? Gosh, I'm sorry, I can't really get this very well. And after Japanese elites had witnessed the European 30-year experience with foreign labor, would Japan change their foreign labor policy?
So if there hadn't been a Yom Kippur War, and it certainly seems, when you read about what was happening then, there's this, I didn't spend a lot of time, but there was something that was happening right in 1973. I'm not remembering the exact details, where they were starting to talk about bringing in numbers of foreign workers in the thousands. And, if that had started, and if things had just continued, we still need more. And there, I think it's possible that Japan would have a lot more foreigners now if they had started in the 70s rather than in the late 80s.
Right. Well, didn't happen, right? One more question: as unskilled work becomes more automated by technology, and all predictions indicate it will continue to do so over the over the what? Over the next decade, is there a chance that Japan can get away with low foreign laborers, strict immigration policy?
I think that's perhaps the hope of some of the people that are anti-immigration. They hope that there could be technological solutions, that robots can do some of these jobs. I mean, it seems like care work is much more difficult to do with robots than maybe some of the other kinds of things that need to happen. But you know, it's hard for me to make a prediction about that. I mean, again, I lived in Tsukuba for a total of, I think, 2.5 years. So there were robots all over the place in Tsukuba, which, you know, Scuba Science City, and there was like a robot crossing zone right by my apartment and everything. But yeah, I guess I don't know enough about robotics to anticipate the ways that might happen. But it certainly seems like, again, care work is something that you really need people for. But
yeah. Okay, so it might depend on the industry, right? Yeah. Let's see. Thanks so much for responding to my broken questions. Will the recording be available to the public? Yes, it will. It will be available on the IAMS website. Thank you for your interesting presentation. Is there an argument to be made of race, ethnicity, and nationality? Who would be the most welcome in Japan?
well, I don't think that this is unique to Japan, but I think that throughout the advanced industrial, probably throughout the world in general, like people with college educations, people that are called high skilled workers, that's a much less controversial kind of immigration. But especially in the advanced industrialized world. But the problem is, I mean, in the Japanese case, that's not where the most serious needs are, where the most serious labor shortages are. So that's one of the tensions. And so, and then, you know, in terms of ethnicity, I mean, I think that Americans and Europeans tend to be perhaps more welcome overall. But yeah, but I think that throughout the advanced industrialized world, what are called high skilled laborers are not nearly as controversial as what are called low skilled laborers or people without educations or manual laborers.
Right. In the social welfare field, wait a minute. In the social welfare field, at least some professionals were very worried about old age care being taken over by people from other Asian countries, as true in Singapore and Taiwan, etc. Is that still a concern?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but so when I was researching this book, the most anti-immigrant group that I talked to was this extremely kind group of nurses. They were from like a prefectural nursing association. They were like the nicest women, but they were really opposed to foreign labor and really opposed even to foreign nurses. And again, I didn't really hear concern about, oh, well, the Vietnamese nurses don't have the right training. They didn't mention that, but it was more that they felt like they were worried about language and they felt like they're just coming and they're sending all their money back to Vietnam. And I said, well, don't you have labor shortages? I mean, how else are you going to get nurses? And they said, oh, and they had a few solutions that they mentioned, which were things like, well, we need to make it easier for nurses to return to nursing after they might have left for a while for childcare. And like, there were a few, and the solutions they mentioned to me seemed like, you know, they seem like good ideas, but they seem like, okay, if Japan needs hundreds of thousands of nurses, the solutions that you're mentioning are not going to generate hundreds of thousands of nurses. So it wasn't so much as professionalization, but I think it was a real concern about maybe nurses coming in from Southeast Asian countries with different norms of nursing and of getting along in society, that they had serious concerns about being in hospitals with those people.
Yeah, it could be. I wonder if they felt that their jobs would change as a result of bringing in foreign nurses whose language skills were not a native speaking skills, you know?
Yeah, I think it's possible they would feel like they would sort of become much more having to try to simplify things or find new ways to say things, or they'd be spending much more of their time trying to do cross-cultural communication instead of
That's
doing
right.
nursing. It's possible. They didn't mention that, and I
Yeah.
feel like I kind of wish that I had asked that question directly, because I think it's a good,
Maybe
it's
we
a
could
good
do another
observation.
project, right?
Yeah.
Another project. Okay, following with David's first question, as Professor Strausz responded that it's more than opening the border to become a migrant nation. Oh, it takes more than opening the border to become a migrant nation. Could I infer that maybe it's necessary for Japan to admit Zainichi Korean citizenship to build a multi-ethnic country? That's the question.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I mean, as far as I understand the Zainichi Korean issue, I'm not sure that activists in the Zainichi Korean community are pushing for sort of citizenship to be automatically conferred. I mean, that might have been an issue like when it was taken away in 1951, like maybe there were people at that time that thought, wait, we were citizens and now we're not, or what happened? But I think now, I mean, what I hear is the Korean citizenship is, for many people that are choosing to maintain their Korean citizenship, it's one of their ties to Korea. So they would, many Zainichi activists would like to be able to keep that citizenship, but still exercise citizenship in Japan too, to sort of have a dual citizenship. And so the big example that it sort of has gone off the political the realm of possibilities under the LDP would be granting them the right to vote in local elections. But for a while, that was a major issue, that the people that were retaining their Korean citizenship wanted to be able to, so they weren't saying make us Japanese citizens, they were saying, no, we want to keep our Korean citizenship, but we still want to vote in local elections because we live in Japanese cities and we want to be able to vote there, right? So I'm not sure that granting those people citizenship would actually be giving all of the Korean activists what they want.
It's complicated, right? Okay. Let's see. Okay, wait a minute. I think I lost the next one.
I can help with
Okay,
it if you
please.
want. Okay, so do you think that the public's opinion regarding immigration, especially Japanese youth, has been changing? The government was supposed to pass a bill revising rules on how to accommodate foreign nationals facing deportation, but it received huge backlash from the Japanese, especially since this March, one of the refugees died at the Nagoya Regional Immigration Service Bureau. I saw a lot of discussion between young Japanese online on how important it is to raise voice on this issue, made me think that online activism is slowly gaining grounds in Japan.
I mean, that's a great question, and I don't have an answer right now. I mean, this is not the first, unfortunately, the first foreigner that's died in custody in Japan, but it does seem she seems to have been portrayed in the Japanese media in a much more favorable way. And like, she's gotten more coverage, I think, than perhaps other earlier cases. And I haven't been following the online discussions, but I find that heartening to hear. I hope that there are lots of Japanese youths that are, want to see foreigners in Japan treated better. But I do think that this case seems somehow different to me than earlier cases of foreigners that died in custody in Japan. And I do hope that leads to better treatment of foreigners in the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Xiaolin, can you give us the next one?
Okay, so the next one is based on the seemingly changing sentiment with the LDP you observed in the 2019 election. How do you think the trajectory of Japanese immigration policy looks like going forward? Some scholars have argued that the 2018 amendment represents a major policy shift, signifying the acceptance of lower skilled labor as well as integrating them. However, the 2018 amendment seems to be suffering from a very slow administrative rollout. COVID-related effects and further reforms are needed to truly address the labor shortage. Do you think such reforms will happen in the short term?
I think that what happened in 2018 shows that it's possible for, even under the LDP, for there to be an expansion of foreign labor in Japan on a large scale. But I think what happens going forward is going to depend on leadership. So it's going to depend. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I've ever heard Suga say anything about immigration or foreign labor as prime minister. I'm sure he has, but I haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it.
But I don't think Suga is going to be prime minister that long, although I could be wrong about that. But who comes after Suga? And there's going to be an election, a lower house election in 2021. Is the LDP going to win? I mean, they probably will. They usually do. But if they don't, and there's some sort of coalition of minority parties that takes over, what are their views? So I think that 2018 proved that it's possible to expand immigration in Japan, even if you call it foreign labor or whatever. But I think that what happens next is going to depend on leadership and who's after Suga and or who's after the LDP.
Thanks.
Okay, so I guess it is just a common complaints from research in the education industry. First, non-Japanese students and parents do not behave as expected, so we need to change what we do. Second, it adds to our workload. I imagine some of the sentiment is similar, as social welfare workers already work long hours and are paid poorly, but just a guess. So I think we do not have more questions from the chat box.
Is that it? It says 24 new messages. I'm not sure. In any case, I see John Campbell is with us this morning. Hello, John. It's nice to see you. Oh, you're muted.
So I am. It's not morning at all. It's dinner time here.
Do you have a question for Mike that you haven't asked yet?
Well, I asked it and you read it and he answered it. But I do think I did want to say that I have a fair amount of sympathy for people. Nurses would be one, but I think social workers or old age care workers, it's remarkable how their gains in professionalism have really raised them into being really an established field, an established, well-respected field. And that it hasn't been true in Singapore. It hasn't been true in Taiwan. It hasn't been true where old age care has been dominated by immigrants coming in from lower wage Asian countries. And it's a pretty clear example. And Japan has this highly professionalized social welfare, particularly in the old age field, as any place in the world, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, they think it's tenuous. I don't think they have that much to fear. And at an individual level, I know that both nurses and social workers have, you could even say, enjoyed working with people from other countries. There are many more foreign-born people in that field than are revealed in the statistics of foreign workers, whether they're the wives of people or illegal visa stayers or something, I don't know. But when you go to a facility, you see all sorts of people, mostly Chinese and Southeast Asians that are working there. And so that's become accepted, but nonetheless, I think it's a legitimate fear that, their position will be undercut.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We have one more question from the chat.
Okay.
Okay, that's even though the Japanese government tried to accept more foreign workers by establishing new types of visas, how do they deal with controversial issues such as the exploitation of foreign labor? Were there any governmental measures taken against it? Are there any activist groups in Japan seeking up to face those challenges?
So, the question of exploitation of foreign labor has definitely come up several times in the last 20 years. So the trainees and technical interns have gotten increasing numbers of protections. They basically are supposed to be treated like Japanese laborers after, I think it was a 2007 reform.
And there
So
was
definitely
another
this is
in
something
2010 had one. also, I
2010.
think.
Okay. That followed the US threatening to move Japan down on the trafficking in persons report. And then in response, Japan sort of increased protections for foreign laborers. Moreover, though, the introduction of those new visa categories was partially supposed to, okay, the sort of legal gray area around these trainees who are really or technical interns who are really employees sets up a situation where they're ripe for abuse, right? They're tied to one particular firm. So instead of doing that, let's bring them in as labor. So part of the rationale for that program was specifically about the concern about exploitation of foreign labor. As the bill was being introduced, I'm trying to remember the details, but something happened where it turned out like there were more deaths of trainees than had been reported. And the opposition was saying, wait a minute, we don't even fully understand the problems with the trainee program, so we can't reform it yet. Let's study these, let's figure out what happened with these deaths and then revise the policy. And the LDP just pushed through the reform anyway. But so it's definitely a concern. But in terms of activists, this is, I would say, there are a number of groups that are concerned about this. And I'm forgetting the names of the groups aren't coming to me, but there's one guy, Tori Ippe, who's really like, this is a major issue for him, is the treatment of foreign migrant workers. He's been terrific on it. He won, the US actually gave him some award for, fighting against human trafficking. But he's involved with a number of different groups, and there's groups that he's not involved with too. I would say this is definitely an issue that activists in Japan are aware of and care about.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. If I could just add, Tori-san's group is Solidarity with Migrants Japan. Ijuren is the Japanese name of it. And oftentimes they accept interns from Waseda and from my classes as well. So if anybody is interested in finding out more about Ijuren, just let me know and I'll put you in touch with that organization. But they're extremely active in fighting for foreign workers' rights and that sort of thing. They were also, I think they were sitting in front of the Homo show just the other day because they didn't want the diet to pass this the new revision of the law that would change things for asylum seekers. So they're on top of all of these things that are going on, and very, extremely active, a very strong voice now, I think. Yeah. Anybody, I see something else here on the chat. Oh, for anyone, wait a minute. I'm not sure where we are.
It's
Xiaolin, can you help?
Yeah, it's just
Sorry, I wasn't paying attention.
URL. Yeah, for anyone interested in group workers against labor exploitation. So she provided us an URL.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's Ijuren.
Yeah, Ijuren. Okay. So of course, Ijuren isn't the only group out there. They're just the one that I am the most familiar with. And so anyway, please check out Ijuren and other groups as well if you folks are interested in learning more and getting involved. Yeah. How are we doing for time? We've got about 5 more minutes or 8 more minutes, something like that. Does anyone else have another question?
Glenda, have we missed Laurie Davies' question? Thank you for the interesting talk. Could you tell us a bit more about what changed in the mindset of LDP members that influenced an increase in support for foreign labor to 72.5%? That was an earlier question. I think we probably have missed it, or Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think we might have missed it. Thank you, Gracia.
It's a great question. And, just in terms of what I was able to observe in the numbers, just looking over, I didn't see, like, I looked at a number of different things. I tried to look at, things like gender and how many, and age, and I looked at a number of different factors. I wasn't able to find any correlations, like in terms of what explains which diet members were becoming more pro-immigrant. So anyway, mathematically, I wasn't able to figure anything out. So I'm not totally sure. I think I have a sense that once Abe pushed through that foreign labor law, creating those 14 new visa categories, I think it would be difficult for people to be an LDP candidate, but oppose something which was a major LDP policy. So I feel like a part of it was perhaps that people felt like, well, I have to support this because I'm in the LDP. And I think that there had been, even in 2017, I think that looking at the 2017 election, diet members from prefectures with fewer people taking any position at all on foreign labor were more likely to, I'll put it another way, diet members from prefectures, as the percentage of diet members in a prefecture taking any position at all on foreign labor went up, that prefecture became more pro-foreign labor. So in other words, that suggests that there's more diet members that are pro-foreign labor, but they don't want to be the first ones in their prefecture to say that, right? Because they don't want to be called out by those far right groups. But once other people start taking positions, and they're willing to come forward too. So they're sort of waiting. They don't want to be the first mover. They're sort of quiet or secret pro-immigration people. And that was true in 2019 as well, right? So as in prefectures where more diet members took a position on foreign labor, those prefectures were also more pro-foreign labor. So I think that so I think there's two things going on. One is the fact that this was a major policy of the LDP. And the other thing is, I think that as more people were taking positions, that sort of freed up more diet members to be like, okay, well, I won't be the first one in my prefecture taking a position, but I'll be the second or the third. That's okay.
Can I add to that it isn't really too surprising that a business-oriented party is in favor of foreign laborers coming in and keeping wages down and all those other things. We find that every place. There's a tension in conservatives among kind of a nativist feeling on the populist right and business, but it really is the LDP is more of a business-oriented party than a populist one, and it's really not a surprising position. It's the earlier opposition because of the fear of the populists that is sort of demands more of an explanation. Anyway, I did want to thank you very much, Michael, for the presentation, and everybody, and Glenda for this discussion. It really has been very illuminating. I haven't been following immigration particularly, but I learned a lot. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, John. This is John Campbell is a professor emeritus from University of Michigan, and he's had an illustrious career studying social welfare in Japan, among other things. Thank you. Do we have any other comment or question? Is this one? I think it is more the threats.
I'm sorry, that's just
me. That's already, okay, that's an old one. Okay, all right, okay. So
I think we got a new one from Jiaxing.
Okay.
What factors do you think that orient the public opinions the most?
What factors orient the public opinions the most?
Yeah, and that's a tricky one. And this is like a major topic of public opinion scholarship in the US, in comparative politics. So I don't have a good answer for that right now, but come back to me. This is something I'm working on. So yeah, I don't have a good answer yet. There's a lot of different factors. It seems like, I mean, one of the things that's come out of the comparative politics literature is it's not just economics. So it's people don't just say, oh, I don't want foreigners if they're going to undermine my employment prospects. That's sometimes a part of it, although usually it's things like xenophobia, or also things like my broader beliefs about what immigration does to my country's economy. Like those things seem to be more important than people's belief about their own employment prospects, which is kind of interesting.
Okay, so I think that about wraps it up, but we are definitely going to come back to you, Mike, and in the future and ask you to tell us about, the research as it comes along, as it goes forward. I think we can all see that there are a lot of nazo, puzzles, and that we as researchers would like to try to dig into and solve as we figure out what is going to happen with migration to Japan. So we really appreciate you coming today and looking forward to that co-produced book in the future. Yeah, yay. And thanks everybody for joining us and for the lively discussion. I really appreciate it.